Hi, I'm Etta Spencer, and I'm going to talk to Derek Paul today. Derek Paul is in Montreal. He's a very dear old friend. He's a retired physics professor, University of Toronto, where I'm a retired sociology professor. And we've, I guess, known each other over the years, very much in the Pugwash movement and other organizations in the Canadian peace movement. So I'm glad to be back in touch with him because he's now living in Montreal. I want to talk to you, Derek, about the new edition of your book. I did read most of, or a large part of, the first edition, but what's the name of your book?
It's called A Leap to an Ecological Economy, and it looks like this in paperback.
Mm-hmm.
The new edition is an online edition.
I hardly ever buy a paper book because I have no place to put them. I've thrown most of my old books away. Really, but probably 80% of my old books, and still the apartment is so jam-packed with books that I don't want any more physical books. I want to get down to talking about economics. This is an area that I am not well trained in. And yet you had some very interesting, innovative ideas in the first edition of your book. I don't know whether you are developing them further. For example, public banks, publicly owned banks, that every post office should have a bank in it. I think that's a very interesting idea.
Oh, I didn't say post offices. I said every single currency area should have one.
All right.
And that was an idea that came to me when thinking about the world problems in the early 2000s. And I consulted a well-known businessman on this who had also been in Parliament. And he said he had thought that for years. So it wasn't a new idea in my head. It was also in the heads of one or two other people back in the early 2000s.
Why hasn't it taken hold? Why do we have all capital managed by private interests? Why can't the public be part of the sector of society that takes interest from making loans and that sort of thing?
I think a partial answer to that is that the original banks were private in the old days, and it's very profitable to be a banker, and that the banks want to keep it that way. In principle, there is a need for most countries have decided to have a national bank, and it's the national bank that has agreements with the chartered banks, and it's the national bank that gives them, or the understanding, the laws of the country that give them the right to issue new money. So it's all a question of who is allowed to create new money by lending it to people. Somebody says, I want to buy a house, and you lend the money, the bank lends the money to buy the house, and interest is received. What the national banks do is to make sure that the amount of money in circulation is about right. Because if you have too much in circulation, you tend to get inflation. And if you have too little in circulation, it means people can't buy the things they need. So the National Bank has a regulatory function. But
let me get clear about what a national bank is. When Janet Yellen was appointed the head of, what is it in the U.S.?
It's called the Fed. It's
Fed, Federal Reserve Corporation, or something like that.
But it's a private bank. It's owned by private interests, people like Rothschilds and other.
No, really?
Banks. Oh yes, it's a private bank.
But she is definitely appointed by the government.
Oh yes, it is. but it isn't owned by the government. The Bank of Canada is owned by the Canadian government or the Canadian people, I'm not sure which, but I rather think it's the government. And the same with the Bank of England. But most national banks are not owned by the country. They're owned by private interests. And they fulfill the function on behalf of the government because they are the government bank and they decide what is going to be the base rate of interest at which they lend money. And that's the factor that determines ultimately the balance of how much money should be in circulation. That's the role of the one of the roles, but it's an important role of the Bank of Canada. And so when you have when you appoint somebody as governor of the Bank of Canada, it has to be somebody competent to judge that. And at the moment, the federal interest rate here in Canada is extraordinarily low. It's 0.25%. And that, since the inflation is 2%, that means that when you borrow money from the federal bank, you're actually getting some money thrown in with it, in addition to what you borrow, to the extent of 1.75%.
I'm sorry, I don't follow that. What?
Well, normally when you have $100 in a bank account, its value goes down over a period of a year because there's inflation. So your $100 is worth $98 of last year's money. And this is one of the reasons why borrowing rates are usually way above 2%, because they, from the bank's point of view, they have to be above the inflation rate. And I'm talking about the chartered banks. But the national bank can issue money at any rate it likes. The governor decides. And so they've, and thank goodness they did, because the federal government last year issued billions of money to help people out who had lost their employment because of the COVID-19. And so it was a godsend. In fact, all three of my editions of my book say that nationally owned, publicly owned national banks are a good thing. But because the nations of the world reacted so appropriately to the emergency of COVID-19 by having their national banks issue a lot of money or obtain a lot of money for them at very, very, very low interest, this need for national banks to be owned by the government is not as clear as it, to me in my head, as it was a year and a half ago. I've slightly changed my mind, but I'm still not certain. And but there's an indication of my sort of slight ambiguity on this question, which I never was ambiguous about before.
Okay, there are a number of things that, as a non-economist and quite an ignorant person about economics, I nevertheless have opinions about. And I have an opinion about something like basic income, guaranteed basic income, which I think would be, I think we're actually easing our way into that because of the COVID situation, where the government has, in fact, provided income to people, to everybody, really, but maybe too much to people like you and me. But it should be a regular thing that really poor people could count on. Do you think that this is something that is actually coming, that a guaranteed income for everybody, of a sort of a basic income being available for the poorest, especially, that this is that we're on the way toward that, and would it be a good thing?
You perhaps didn't know this, but I studied this in some depth in 2010 as a result of a government motion in a unanimous vote in the Canadian House of Commons in November of 2009, that the government should do something about poverty. And this vote was unanimous. Even the members of the same cabinet that did nothing thereafter voted for the motion. And a few days later came a Senate report on the same subject. And this prompted me to do a study of guaranteed income, which I did, and I gave three small seminars with about 8 people at each on the subject in April of 2010. And the important thing I have to say here is that the people who discuss guaranteed income are more than 99.9% of them are people who haven't done the arithmetic. And I did the arithmetic for Canada. It took me a month. It's not simple. And it's practical, but there's a form of guaranteed income which is much, much more useful, especially in the present context. And that's guaranteed employment. You see, if people have guaranteed employment, they have a guaranteed income, but they're having to do something for it. And the reason I came to that conclusion is because if you want to address climate change, which is what my book is about, the title is Economics, but it's really about facing up to climate change and bringing the world into a situation where we're not exhausting our resources. And if you look at that question, there's an immense amount of work to do. This is one of the problems of government. The governments largely, maybe the Danish government may be an exception and a few others, but most governments haven't realized how tremendously much there is to do if you want to address climate change and bring civilization into a sustainable state. And
okay, now let me give you trouble, because here I do have an opinion.
Yeah.
And I think I would disagree with you about the desirability of guaranteeing employment, because I've visited Soviet countries, socialist countries, when they were really still, socialist communist regimes. And I was astounded by the laziness and of the workers, of everybody I knew. It was unbelievable how slouchy they were and irresponsible as workers. Really, they didn't do a tenth as much work as they would under a capitalist system.
I agree with that, Meta, but the reason for that, it wasn't because employment was guaranteed. It was because, and I studied the Soviet system too firsthand, it's because in all of the industries there was no incentive.
No, it's because they couldn't fire them. Nobody could be fired. You couldn't get rid of a worker. You tell somebody to show up on time and they come 3 days late. And you couldn't do anything about it. Everybody had a job, and just like everybody had an apartment. And the apartments were terrible and the jobs were done badly.
But there has to be an incentive to work if you want people to work, and there wasn't. And that's a feature of the Soviet system as it was.
Well, but the main thing is there has to be a floor. There has to be something where you can say, this is not good enough, goodbye, just out. I want to get somebody else.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm not suggesting that there should be jobs and that you wouldn't be able to fire people. I think, but
if you guarantee employment, it means everybody can have some job and do it as badly as they want, and they are still going to have a job.
No, they're not. They're going. If they do it that badly, they're going to be fired. But there'll be other jobs, or they can go for more training or something like that. But you're never going to have a world without somebody somewhere having bad attitudes. Even in
yes, it's just that when you say a guaranteed employment, it means you are guaranteeing that they will have some job, and no matter how badly they do it, it doesn't matter. They will get paid for this job.
Yeah, until they're fired, which will be very soon if
But
they
you
do
can't
not
fire
do it.
somebody if you have a guarantee.
Of course you can. I don't mean by guaranteed income, I mean that there will be jobs that are being offered that people can apply for. And of course, if they apply for something,
But
general
that
manager,
means that if I am, a half-wit with no capacity to do least bit of work, somebody will find a job for me anyway. And all I have to do is sit home and I will be paid for that job. If that's what a guaranteed employment is, it means I have a job no matter how badly I do it. And that's what I find unacceptable. It just won't work, Derek.
well,
Easy to give people a check. It's easy to write a check and put it in their bank account every month. It's
okay,
easy to put it on their cell phone so they can spend it on their cell phone. But if you start paying people for work that they don't do, I'm sorry, but I have had trouble having to fire people who worked for me because they were slouchy and took advantage of me. I don't appreciate that.
you kick them out in that case. But in industrial countries today, especially in Europe, it's much worse than North America. There was a year and a half ago, there was a high in the average employment in Europe, in the European Union, and that was a low in the unemployment was 9%. You can't tell me that there are 9% of Europeans who aren't capable of doing some job. And that's because the system allows that. And we have to get away from that system where you can have 9%. Let's say that 3 of them were unemployable, but the other 6 of the 9 should be able to find jobs. You're going to have unemployable people in any system. I agree with that from your point of view. But our system is worse because it allows huge amounts of unemployment. What you do in a just system, if you have, let's say you have 98% employment. I've lived in a city with 99.5% employment and only 0.5% unemployment.
Where and when?
It was in the post-war years. It was 1953, and anybody could get a job in a matter of days. And the unemployment, which was 0.5%, represented the people who were between jobs. So I've lived through it. I know that 99.5% in an employment in an industrial city is possible. It might not be possible everywhere, but it was possible in that city. People were used to working in factories. And so if they lost their job, they applied for another one and they got them. They got the other one. There was a boom in trade after World War II.
Mm-hmm. Okay, why do you think that guaranteeing employment is better than guaranteeing income?
I think it's only better than guaranteeing income in the situation where there's a lot of very important work to be done. And that is the situation we're in.
Oh, okay. Oh, so you think, all right, okay.
I
Well,
think,
I don't disagree that there's a lot of work to be done, although I don't know how much of it we have a workforce that's capable of doing. For example, I mean, the logical thing about how to get rid of coal mining is to give new jobs in building wind turbines to the coal miners.
yes,
But can that be done? Can they, some people who have spent their life digging in mines are just simply not going to be able to make that kind of transition to technology, high tech employment. And most of the new jobs will be, I assume, um, pretty demanding technological jobs.
I think you're right about on the industrial side, but I think what most people have ignored so far is that, and this is why chapter 6 in my book is very important. It's because um, the human race has, generally speaking, degraded its forests and its fields so that they are less fertile than they were 40 years ago. And 40 years ago, they were probably less fertile than 40 years before that. And So we have degraded our surroundings. And uh, there are known ways of bringing these things back to a high level, higher even than they were at the beginning of the 20th century. And that is outdoor work partly, and the sort of people who've been doing manual work who will lose their jobs if a coal mine closes, which was the example you took. They will be willing to, or some of them will be willing to, and they'll certainly be able to do those jobs. One of my, and I think you're in agreement with this because I'm not sure we talked about it, but one of the most important things to do in the world now is to increase the number of organic farms.
Well, I was just about to ask you about that, or
Yes.
to begin speculating in my own mind about that, because organic is maybe I don't think that's the right word for it. I think carbon farming is a more general term that, because organic is a very specific kind
Yes.
of carbon farming, but there's a more general category that I think really the whole world needs to very quickly shift to. And I think it can actually, from what I've read, it could sequester a hell of a lot more carbon than has been
Yes.
figured on.
Yes.
So, but now, is that going to be more manual labor? For example, one of the things that we would do is stop plowing. Well, if you stop plowing, you plant plants by drilling a hole in the ground and sticking a seed in it. And then you got the problem of the weeding and so on, and not using chemicals. I believe that's more labor intensive,
Yes.
but I don't know. Now, if we shift over to really worldwide, I mean, if we could do it that quickly, training farmers to do the right kind of farming that's ecologically good, would they need to do more physical labor themselves than with the kind of machinery? For example, there's heavy machinery now that people use for most farm equipment, and this compacts the soil. What are you going to do about that? I don't know. I haven't heard that conversation about the relationship between the kind of labor involved in farming and the technology that needs to be adopted in order to make it really good.
I think you have a partial answer to that in the price of organic food, because the organic farm grows very good quality food and plenty of it, and but it ends up more expensive in the shops, and I think that's because it's more labor intensive. And this is something that the human race is going to have to learn to put up with. That certain foods are going to cost more, but they're going to be better for you. So your health is going to improve, and maybe you can eat slightly less of it and still improve your health. So I think
I think both of us are guessing on this. I think I ought to spend the time to inquire, see if anybody's done that research to really say how much difference it's going to make in the amount of human labor if all of the beneficial forms of farming were adopted.
Well, I think the changeover from one kind of farming to another, certainly that is more labor intensive. And some farmers have done it, but they've done it themselves by working extra hard, unreasonably long hours, you might say. But I think that generally speaking, I think I've contacted organic farmers and people, and I've got a whole library of books on the subject, and it seems to me that it is an area where employment can be created.
And you mentioned forestry, and I think if we did this, they're recommending that we need 1 trillion more trees, and that would take care of quite a bit in time over a period of years. Would really not completely solve the climate problem, but do go very far toward it. But to have 1 trillion more trees, you really have to plant at least 2 trillion more, because trees die. They don't necessarily survive. And to me, that's a very interesting challenge, because you're going to have to plant trees in places where people don't live. around cities, yes, it's great to do much more urban forestry, but that's not going to take care of the whole thing. You're going to have to go to the tops of mountains that the human beings have never even walked on before. And how are you going to take, I was interested for a while in the use of drones for planting trees, but as far as I can tell, there are real serious limitations on being able to do that. You can do it in some places, but I think it's not great. So I think that if we just did the maximum or the optimum amount of tree planting right now, that would immediately take care of every spare human being, and with every spare half an hour of their labor time that's available in the world, because we need a trillion is 1,000 billion. And a lot of countries say, "Oh, we're being really foreseeing
And there's a
and
thousand.
doing great things. We're gonna plant 1 billion trees." Well, phooey. You need 1,000 countries promising to plant 1 billion trees if you want 8 trillion, and we need 2 trillion. So there your labor job situation would certainly be taken care of there if we could do it, which is not realistic. Yeah. Okay. I've delivered myself of an issue there on that I think is really important. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about corporations, because I probably the one issue that I think we can all agree on is that corporations have too much political power. I mean, they in some countries that I will not even name, they're allowed to pay for the elections practically, supporting the candidates and funding candidates that they want, to the extent that really it's business interests that have way too much influence on the outcomes of democratic elections. So what are we going to do about corporations? I think that the biggest challenge is to democratize, or at least to make corporations accountable to the public welfare, well-being. And there are a couple of measures that I've heard of. One being, I think this is probably a rhetorical position. People saying that corporations are treated as persons legally, that they have the rights of individuals for as to speak, to spend their money as they see fit, to vote, to all kinds of things. And in fact, I know of a woman who carried out a wedding. She invited people to the park, and she married a corporation, just to make fun of the idea that a corporation was an individual or a person. Um, so how to I don't know what would happen if we rescinded that legal principle that a corporation is a person. And not only that, but how do we do more to make them accountable to the law, or to the stakeholders whose lives are affected by them? Um, I had a conversation about 15 years ago with Michael Lerner, who had a book called The Left Hand of God. And he was arguing that what should be done is that corporations should be issued a charter for only 5 or 10 years. And then at the end of that time, they should be their performance should be reviewed to see whether or not they had upheld the public welfare in their decision making. And if they were found to have done bad things, harmful things to the environment, or to their customers, or their employees, or any other group of people, they should have the charter taken away and issued, given to some other outfit. And so he and I had a bit of a quick conversation about that, in which I said that didn't sound to me like as realistic, but that we could have various communities of interest, whether they be employees, or um, environmentalists or um, um, public health people, various people who have concerns about um, the the um, the way corporations are affecting the public welfare. We could each have panels of people that we elect, NGOs. You and I could run to be on the board, on the panel of peace activists. And corporations should be required to appoint one person from each of these panels to their board of directors. So let's say you get to be appointed to Shell Oil, and I get to be appointed to, some manufacturing company, and we would be on the board, and on the board there would also be people representing people who are concerned about public health, and feminist organizations, and child welfare organizations, and unions, and so on. So a number of different interests and stakeholders would be represented on the board of directors, along with the owners, the people who actually own the stock, which is, I guess, they're the only people who elect boards of directors now. And our job would be to make sure that whatever decisions the corporation make should be in public welfare. Tell me, which of these approaches would you prefer, or if any? And do you have another idea instead?
I think it would be very difficult from where we are now to implement any of those ideas immediately. But I think one thing that is absolutely necessary is for those countries um, uh, that can to stop regarding each other as in competition, but to act together where corporations are concerned.
Mm.
The problem has been all through my life that, or all through my recent life anyway, that corporations can take advantage of the fact that countries see each other as in commercial competition. And so they can always strike a better bargain here for themselves or there.
Uh-huh.
Um, what is needed is for them, for national governments to see themselves as in the same boat, that they're tending to be dominated by corporations, and to let it be known that they're not going to allow that. And this is one of the, I'm glad you brought this up, because um, I was at a conference on taxation, which was an online conference, a Zoom conference,
Mm-hmm.
about 4 months ago. And one of the speakers was the Minister of Finance of France. And what he has done about round about 2017, he introduced a 3% tax on digital corporations. So corporations that do all their business uh, um, online, and they don't have any stores anywhere or any offices anywhere that anybody knows about, they can be taxed anyway. And what they were taxed on was not clear from what he said, but it was a small tax. He took the risk of enforcing this tax. The corporations all paid the tax, and other European countries started to follow. So it it struck me as being the first step on the road to trying to keep corporations that indulge in excesses online under some kind of control that's to everybody's benefit. And it's in my book. It was in at the last minute when the thing was uh, uh, practically ready to publish. It's in the third edition.
I think it's a lot bigger issue than just claiming the taxes for companies that may not be located anywhere except in cyberspace, um, because it's a question of making what they do accountable.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
the business plans acceptable, so they're not, oh, let's say, raising cattle in Brazil where they're cutting down rainforest to raise cattle or something, so that a company that did that would have to be pilloried for doing it. I think, and I don't know whether this taxation plan of the French government would cover anything like that. I would doubt it.
I think, yeah, I think that it's it's a social question which I have no knowledge of at all, because I've been concentrating very, very much on the things that I think must happen if we're ever going to face up to the climate change threat.
But
And
I
that is,
think,
it's important, but it's something you can deal with afterwards, I think.
yeah, but no, because okay, let me take the case of the cattle ranching in Brazil,
Yeah.
because
Okay.
Brazil has this horrible Bolsonaro government,
Yeah.
which has been trying to emulate Trump in every possible way,
Yeah.
and they caused hell in the last COP meetings, the Paris Accord meetings,
Yes.
by they're not going to play by the rules anymore. They're not going to fulfill whatever they promised to do. And and Bolsonaro is giving a free hand to everybody who wants to cut down the rainforest and do
Yeah.
whatever they please, which is absolutely lethal for the planet. We have to have the oxygen, that they
Yeah.
that's produced, and it isn't the oxygen. We need to have them sequester the carbon, really. So we can't allow that, but there is no international control
Right.
because governments are national governments. The international, this Paris Agreement doesn't really have any way, as far as I know, of forcing. Now, what I suppose they want, although I never really heard Bolsonaro's people say, just pay us. But clearly, what we should be doing is offering, okay, you're not going to stop this burning of the rainforest because you should. Then how much do you want financially for, we'll pay you to take care of the thing because we all need those trees to be there. Um, so, this is where nationalism, not only in terms of the laws governing businesses being accountable only to national governments, but the laws regarding the enforcement of climate policies being administered by national governments that may not want to play ball.
Well, let's face it, Bolsonaro is a tyrant. There are many other tyrants. He's not the only one in the world.
Yeah.
But he is a particularly destructive one from the point of view of environmental considerations. And uh, that is a question on which the world has very little experience. What do you do about it? Uh, there isn't a simple recipe at the present time. It's a question, as a matter of fact, I'm glad you raised it, because it's a question I've been raising with other people. What are we going to do about tyrants when we've solved all the other problems?
Well, tyrants are, bad enough in the, they go around like what's happening in Burma now. They tyrants abusing people and abusing human rights. That's bad enough, but it's lethal for the whole world if we don't come up with some sort of system of making sure that national governments pursue good environment, climate change policies. And it's not so much their political repression in this case as it is how do we save the rainforests? And if the government is, he could be legally elected. I'm sure he was. I mean,
Yeah,
a lot of these
yeah,
dictators are chosen by democracies. No kidding. I mean,
yeah,
that's given me a lot of grief thinking about how the current obvious limitations on democracy, how they're, you know, vulnerable democracy is, because people are stupid enough to elect really bad governments and that enforce really bad policies.
Yeah.
That's a whole conversation that's quite different.
But there are things that could be done, especially via the United Nations. But I think trade sanctions could work, um, and could have some effect.
Okay, how do you do that? I mean, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Trade
Anyway, this
sanctions.
is not a thing I'm expert on, but I think that when something as bad as that happens, as Bolsonaro's uh, um, implicit uh, campaign to destroy the forest, um, when when that sort of thing happens, the world needs to really get together and say what are we going to do about it, and you need to have a lot of countries in agreement with what to do about it
Mhm.
if you want to have an effect from the outside. It worked with South Africa. There were a lot of people who didn't like the apartheid policy, and eventually the international opposition in the form of sanctions and the low opinion in which the NAT government in South Africa was held um, uh, had an effect. It took years. It didn't happen overnight. It took many years. But it did have an effect.
Mm. Well, there are another couple of things that we should talk about in terms of economic innovations. What, and I don't know enough about them to really have anything to say except to raise the question. One would be corruption, but I'm thinking not just of uh, businesses corrupt, government employees being bought off and paid for, but also the possibility of companies locating themselves, let's say in the Cayman Islands or someplace, as a way of avoiding taxes. That apparently quite a lot of the money that should be going into taxes from corporations, maybe also from individuals, I'm sure, um, get escape the tax collectors because corporations will pretend that they exist and they really only have a post office box in some country that has very lenient tax laws. So it's a form of theft. And I remember Wilson Pritchard gave a talk a couple of years ago that I organized, and he was studying that closely, um, ways in which countries could cooperate to make it difficult or impossible for
Yeah.
uh, corporations and individuals to do that. Do you know anything about that?
Uh, I don't in any detail, but the key word you just said it yourself is cooperation. If the nations really wanted to stop that, they would have to get together and say what are going to be the rules.
Mhm.
And I've sort of made a bit of a joke about it in my book because I call that process um, starting a new charter, and and I point out that um, in the Magna Carta of the year 1215, it was the barons, the bad boys, who got together and forced the king to agree. Uh, so it was the king who was giving the trouble, and the barons wanted to bring him online and make him behave properly. Today, it's the opposite. It's the governments are doing their best, and the corporations are making life very difficult for them by avoiding taxes and etc. and bribing people to make the governments do this and that. And so it's the reverse process. And I'm convinced nothing will happen until a substantial number of important governments get together and say, this is what we're going to demand of you, and, and you meaning the corporations. I think when that happens, there will be a change. And I saw the French um, finance minister, Bruno Le Maire is his name, I thought his imposition of tax on corporations that had been avoiding tax altogether was a first step, but it's a tiny first step. And I'm just hoping that something will come of that.
Oh, but
This,
that was just digital, wasn't it? Just
that's
digital.
what he said, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know the guy, and but he is a magnificent speaker, and I was very impressed at his contribution to that conference, that online conference.
Mhm.
And,
Sticking back to the question of corporations and making them more responsive to public welfare, you mentioned something that I was not familiar with in the, at least the first edition of your book, benefit corporations. Can
yes,
you explain what that is and whether
yeah.
that would be a good thing to promote?
Um, I've already said it. I think it's a good thing to promote. It was an idea that arose spontaneously in one of the US states. Today, there are at least 30 states in the United States that have enacted legislation that makes it legal for a group of people who want to incorporate a new company to make it a benefit corporation. And the difference between a benefit corporation and any other corporation is that in addition to trying to make a profit for the shareholders, they have at least one social goal. And they decide what that social goal is going to be. We're going to improve agriculture, or we're going to improve this, or we're going to make do forestry better, or whatever it is. Um, or we're going to make, and so they decide what their social goal is going to be, and thereafter, if they don't try to do that, then the directors are defaulting on their obligations under their corporation. So, for example, the oil companies should have goals that are quite different than just making a profit, but that hasn't happened. They weren't forced at any time to become benefit corporations. In fact, there weren't any in the old days back until 2010. There are
I'm
not
sorry,
very
did you
many.
say when 2010 is when benefit corporations came
When
into
the,
existence
the
or what?
first the first legislation of any state was, I think, in 2000.
This is not an old idea. It's a new thing.
Yeah, it's a new thing, and uh, so having passed the legislation in Maryland or whichever the state was, uh, they then had to wait because they couldn't force people to choose to be a. So they waited, and one or two corporations in the United States, a few corporations have decided, yes, they want to be benefit corporations. And so they choose
Oh, they
that.
changed. They could change from being privately owned, privately controlled to being a benefit corporation after they're already functioning, huh?
I don't know about that. I haven't looked into that question. So,
Oh, okay.
but
Mm-hmm.
usually the idea is that to encourage new corporations to become benefit corporations.
Mm-hmm.
And there are now two other countries where you can do that. One is Italy, and the other is in South America. It's Colombia.
Really.
Yeah,
And so it's like declaring to the company to be concerned not with upholding the best interests of their stake of their stockholders, but to be concerned about the public interest
as well. Yes, both.
as
They
well.
can't ignore the stockholders, but they have some other goal that will benefit the people of Colombia.
Well, what if you just change the laws regarding corporations and simply redefined it and say this, fiduciary responsibility is to the public welfare. But of course, then the question is how you would enforce that. In fact, how do the benefit corporations enforce it? If they say they're going to be a benefit corporation, but they go ahead and do bad things, who's going to catch them and discipline them?
That's a good question. We don't have enough experience yet. to find out what actually happens in such a case.
Well,
But
I
that
would think that would be
eventually
a,
there'll be a case. Yeah.
yeah, that would really be the way forward, wouldn't it? To experiment, see how these guys are doing, and then impose some new mechanism legally to make sure that the benefit corporations behave themselves and
Yep.
get disciplined if they don't. And then, of course, we've been within shooting distance of being able to redefine all corporations as benefit corporations that have, subject to the same rules. I think maybe that's how we're going to carry out the revolution, Derek.
it, it's a possible line, and I think at some point this idea will probably take off. It certainly took off in the United States because you have more than half the states now are uh, allow benefit corporations. They don't enforce them. You can still register as a regular corporation. So
Okay, let me ask one final question about the economy, and that is Thomas Piketty, a few years ago published this very important book, um, arguing that the only way to stop the growing inequality in every country that he can see, the only solution is to tax wealth and not just income, or maybe not income at all, but wealth. I don't know what the distribution would be between the two forms of taxation, but it was a radical idea at the time, or was considered radical. But I think during this last election, it became actually a plank in the campaigns of some of the, I believe, Elizabeth Warren, for one, and maybe several others, I don't know, in the U.S. were arguing for the imposition of wealth tax. And I don't know where that has gone. I don't think I've heard anybody say that that is being done now. But I, Piketty persuaded me, what was it, 5, 6 years ago? What do you think about that?
um, I don't have a strong opinion on that, but I think that an option that countries would have, if they have a substantial number of people in their country who have absolutely colossal wealth, I think that they will need, at the very least, to have the right to direct a certain portion of their investment, because a finance minister or a business minister of a country knows what is needed, and I think there are also some things that are needed right now. Right now, there's a thing called the third economy. Have you heard of that?
No.
And there's a book on the subject, and essentially it has to do with investments that have nothing to do with production. Okay, so if I invest in a company that makes cookies, then my investment goes into factories, and the cookies get sold, and if I'm lucky, I get a dividend. But there are things you can invest in which are basically paper, things like insurance, various kinds of insurance, and so on. And it becomes the investments in that part of the economy, of the stock market, are rather like gambling in a casino, where you're just playing games and hoping to get some paper money out of it.
Mhm.
And the fact is that it doesn't have any relationship to production. And wealthy people have discovered long ago that a way to get rich quickly and have a very comfortable life is to invest in that kind of thing. And you spend a lot of time buying and selling these stocks at a great rate, and then you build up huge amount of capital. And I think that there is a very, very great need immediately for a tax on that kind of investment um, in the form of slowing down the investments. In other words, um, if you buy a stock and you sell at a profit within a certain number of days,
Mm-hmm.
uh, um, you pay to the government a large fraction of
Mm-hmm.
the in gain in the investment. And I think this would bring this would get rid of the gambling house and put the money in some sort of proportions to where it needs to be. And so a lot of people, a lot of the very rich today, and the people who are getting rich on in the third economy, um, they have lost sight in their own minds about what really makes the world tick. What really makes the world tick is the farmers who do our food and the people who design and produce our clothes and our vehicles and everything we have in our houses. And and
Well, yes, but excuse me,
the
but I
third
think,
economy is completely removed from that.
yeah, I'm a little ambivalent about that because you're only talking about people who produce physical things. And I think the solution to the question of growth has to do with the type of change that takes place in the economy where people are not selling and manufacturing physical things, but are selling and producing ideas or intangible things. I mean, of the people I know personally, among my network of friends, very, very few are doing. I know one carpenter. That's the only friend I have who's a carpenter. He's actually making shelves in my apartment sometimes. But
Okay.
other than that, my friends all do what you and I do. We teach, we taught physics or sociology, or we did therapy on mentally disturbed people, or we write poems and then now they're being published online rather than in even physical books, or we give advice to people on various economic or insurance or things of that kind. We
Yeah,
do we produce things that are ideas and knowledge, but and
knowledge.
and
Yes.
not physical things. And that, by the way, is relevant to a debate that you and I have had in the past about whether or not economic growth is essential. And I
That,
think the
that's
economic,
that's part of the second economy. And that because if you educate people so that you've got very fine technicians and so on in the world, that kind of service is wealth building, and that's not part of the third economy. The third economy is pure gambling, and so what you're talking about is where more investment is needed. But if 2/3 of our money is being spent on the other things, then there's too little going into those things. That's the point. I think it was Greer was his name. I have the book here.
okay, let me ask one more question before we quit, and it has to be a fairly short one, and that is about the Tobin tax. The notion that there should be a tax on money being transferred around the world from one country to another. And this is a bit risky, having all this money being sloshed around in online, every day. And if we took a tiny percentage of it and devoted it to whatever the United Nations, or what's the prospect that will become reality?
I just can't estimate that at all.
And this has been fun. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Take care.